Hello, everyone, and welcome back or welcome to Eros and Exegesis. This is my podcast. My name is Evan Francis Murray, and this is the stage 2 of Plato. So I did a stage 1, which was the Socratic introduction, short, dramatic, and foundational. The point was to establish, Socrates' personality, method, and his trial. So we went through Ion. It's the poetic inspiration. It's short and it's a short and fun read. Euthyphro, which is about piety, and a really great way to understand the Socratic method. We did the Apology, which was Socrates' defense speech. Crito, justice and obedience to law. And we ended stage 1 with the Phaedo, the death of Socrates and the soul's immortality. So stage 2 is, early Socratic dialogues, the aporia, ending in puzzlement. So these, all of these will probe a single virtue or concept. So our first one we're starting out with is Laches. And Laches is about courage. Plato's Laches, the courage to not know. So this is my lecture on the dialogue concerning courage. So I'm going to kind of give my thoughts, try to go in a real roundabout way to think outside of the text, inside the text. And finally, I will leave you with a complete rendition of the text by going through the numbers with you of the actual work itself. So we're going to start out with I guess I'll call this, I don't want to call it part 1. I'll just call it 1 is the weight of the Father's name. So I'd like you to consider a man who sits in the shadows of a grand ancestral hall. On the walls hang the bronze shields and civic crowns of his father, a statesman whose very name commanded assemblies, brokered peace, and shaped the fate of a city. Every guest who passes by, they bow to the monument of that memory. Yet, when our gaze turns to the son of that man sitting in the corner, it's as if he were merely furniture in his father's house. He did not squander the family fortune, nor did he commit some infamous crime. He did something far quieter and more corrosive. While his father was away governing the empire, the son was left to idle in the courtyards, untutored and unformed. He grew into a man of no public deed, no battlefield triumph, no voice in the council. He's basically a ghost dwelling in the architecture of this giant of a man, his father. Now, that son, that boy, the person we're talking about, he has children of his own. And in a desperate attempt to summon the greatness that skipped his own generation, he bestows upon his boys the illustrious names of their grandfathers. But without a doubt, the names feel like oversized armor on frail frames. Every time he calls his son by his father's name, he feels a sharp pang of shame. What if the boys discover that their own father is a hollow bridge between a glorious past and an anonymous future? Convinced of his own inadequacy and detached from the currents of civic power, he doesn't even trust, fully himself to raise his son in the way that he should be raised. Instead, he turns outward to the reigning elites of the day, the decorated generals and wealthy politicians whose names still carry weight in the assembly. He watches them inspect the latest educational fads, ready to purchase any technical training or physical novelty that promises to manufacture excellence from the outside in. This is not merely an allegory of family guilt. It is the exact dramatic engine of Plato's Laches. When Lysimachus and Melesias stand at the palæstra, they do not arrive as confident patriarchs seeking a simple school recommendation. They come as self-confessed failures of the Athenian elite. Lysimachus is the son of Aristides, the just, whose integrity was legendary. Melesias is the son of Thucydides, the aristocratic rival of Pericles. Yet across their entire adult lives, neither man has achieved a single noble deed in war or peace. Paralyzed by their own domestic obscurity and terrified that their sons will inherit their silence, they defer entirely to the celebrated generals Nicias and Laches. Their tragedy and their shame is that in their desperation to escape mediocrity, they mistake the prestige of military experts for the possession of wisdom, seeking an external cure for an internal void. Some of us are not spectators to Lysimachus and Melesias' shame. We may very well be participants in it. The question before us is whether shame can become the beginning of something other than silence, whether the recognition of our own emptiness can be transfigured into the courage to seek what we do not possess. It's a multi-layered dialogue we will be examining. Plato wrote the Laches in 390, the 390s BC, less than a decade after Socrates' execution, in an Athens that's still raw from defeat in the Peloponnesian Wars, still haunted by civil strife, still uncertain whether its traditional education could produce the men in the city needed. The dialogue belongs to that group of earlier Socratic works, alongside with Charmides, Lysias, Euthydemus, Protagoras. These stories that share a distinctive structure, a definitional inquiry into some virtue conducted by Socrates with one or more interlocutors ending in aporia. That state of perplexity that Greek philosophy designated not as failure, but as the necessary threshold of genuine understanding. Yet the Laches is unique within this group, and the specificity of its uniqueness is what we must grasp if we are to understand what Plato is doing here. The dialogue is the only one in which Socrates interrogates men significantly older than himself, established generals, wealthy and powerful, whose courage no Athenian would question. It is one of the few dialogues in which Socrates' own conduct in battle is praised by a fellow soldier. Laches himself testifies that at the defeat of Delium in 424, Socrates fought with a discipline and composure that shamed those around him. And it is only the early dialogue whose central dramatic theme is education. Not education in the abstract, but literally the concrete, anxious education of sons by fathers who fear their own failure will become their children's inheritance. As James Arati has observed in his dramatic study interpreting Plato, the Laches is saturated with a grim historical irony that Plato's original audience could not have missed. Every character on stage was dead when the dialogue was written, and many of them had dies in the waste that exposed the hollowness of the reputations they defend. We shall return to this dramatic dimension, for it's not ornamental, but it's quite essential to the dialogue's philosophical meaning. What we face in the Laches is a question that refuses to stay academic. Can virtue be taught? Can courage, the virtue that seems most rooted in temperament, in bodily instinct, in the raw confrontation with danger, can it be reduced to knowledge? And if it can, what kind of knowledge is it? The kind of general possesses from commanding armies? The kind of philosopher possesses from dialectical inquiry? Or some third thing that neither the warrior nor the thinker has yet conceived? These are not merely ancient questions. They press upon every parent who has wondered how to make a child brave without making them reckless. Every teacher who has tried to instill moral courage alongside intellectual skills. Every citizen who has watched leaders confuse stubbornness with resolve. The Laches speaks to us because we are still asking what the Laches asked and still failing to answer it. The dialogue's authenticity has never been seriously questioned. Aristotle refers to it in the Nicomachean Ethics when discussing courage. Thrasyllus placed it in the fifth tetralogy alongside the Charmides and Lysis. Its style, structure, and philosophical content are unmistakably Platonic. Walter T. Schmid's monograph on manly courage remains the most comprehensive English language study, arguing that the dialogue explores the relationship between the conventional understanding of courage held by military men and the Socratic demand for a definition that will capture the essence of virtue. More recently, Christopher Emmeline Jones' Cambridge commentary in the 2023 Apeiron article by Georgia, and I'm going to have a problem with this, Georgia Sermamaglo Solmadi. They've opened fresh interpretive paths that we shall have occasion to traverse. But let us not begin with scholarship. Let us begin where Plato begins, with two old men, ashamed of their lives, desperate for their sons, and about to discover that the experts they have consulted know no more than they do. We have not come to the Laches as first-time readers of Plato. We have come after 25 centuries of commentary to a particular moment. This is my 7th episode of Eros and Exegesis, and we carry with us a specific trail of reading. Before we stepped into this Athenian wrestling ground, like I had expressed earlier, we already passed through 5 encounters that forever shape what we see here. The journey began with what we might call the Socratic introduction, a suite of dialogues, short, dramatic, and foundational, each one establishing something essential about the man whose presence now fills the palæstra. We read the Ion and watched Socrates gently unravel a rhapsode's claim to knowledge, learning that inspiration without understanding is a kind of beautiful blindness. We read the Euthyphro and discovered the Elenchus in its purest form, the Socratic method, the question, what is piety? We pursued this until the confident priest retreats into confusion, leaving us with the unsettling truth that the man about to prosecute his own father cannot truly say what holiness truly is. Then came the apology, where Socrates stands before the city and refuses to save his own life, by pretending to a wisdom he does not possess, where he tells Athens that the unexamined life is not worth living and accepts the hemlock as the price of that conviction. The Crito followed, and we saw him in prison, offered escape, refusing it because justice is not a thing to be traded against survival. And finally, the Phaedo, that long afternoon in the death cell, where Socrates argues for the soul's immortality, speaks of philosophy as the practice of dying, and drinks the poison with the same composure his fellow soldier Laches once admired on the battlefield of Delium. This is what we know before we sit down beside Lysimachus and Melesius. We know the man who will be asked to judge the value of fighting in armor is the same man who will be executed on the charge of corrupting the youth. We know the generals who now bicker over military training, Nicias and Laches, will die within a few years, one in the stone quarries of Syracuse and one on the field at Mantia, both in causes that will destroy Athenian power. We know that the fathers who are so ashamed of their own mediocrity are themselves the sons of celebrated grandfathers, and that the boys sitting silently through the conversation, young Aristides and Thucydides, named for those very grandfathers, will inherit a city already fatally wounded. The result is that when we read the Laches now, in this episode from this vantage, the dramatic irony we spoke of earlier is not a literary ornament. It is the very substance of our seeing, of the essence of this dialogue and this philosophical investigation. We read, listen, and watch these men search for a definition of courage with the absolute knowledge that they have already lived and died. What they hear in this dialogue cannot define. Socrates has already been courageous in the way that matters most, not merely standing firm in the phalanx, that's amongst the Athenian army, but standing firm before a jury of 500 fellow citizens, refusing to trade truth for safety. Laches has already praised that courage at Delium, and yet he cannot say what courage is. Nicias has already displayed the caution that will doom an army, mistaking piety for wisdom. The whole dialogue is a flashback illuminated by a funeral pyre that Plato must know by now so very well. This is what 25 centuries of hindsight permit us, not to solve the dialogue's aporia, but to inhabit it more deeply. The Laches is an early dialogue, formally Socratic, aporetic, an inquiry that ends in perplexity. But when we read it after the Phaedo, after the apology, it ceases to be merely early. It becomes a kind of dramatic premonition, a rehearsal of the very failure to transmit wisdom to the city's execution of Socrates that will make absolute. The question, can courage be taught? It becomes in this light the question, can Socrates teach Athens? And the answer, which we already know, is that Athens will kill its teacher. And I suppose in some ways never learn. And in others, well, I guess they learned the hard way. And yet, and this is why we are here, why this podcast exists, and why we return to these texts. Socrates' execution was not the end. The Laches survived. Socrates' questions survived. The aporia that seemed like failure because the starting point for 2.5 millennia of philosophy, theology, and moral psychology. When we, in the 7th episode of Eros and Exegesis, listen to Laches stumble over his own definition and hear Nicias' quote Socrates back to himself in a way that misses the point, we are not merely spectators of an ancient embarrassment. We are participants in the same search, the beneficiaries of the same perplexity, and we bring it to the full weight of everything we know about how these stories end. Both the tragedy of Athens and the strange, stubborn life of the questions that outlasted it. So, let us enter the wrestling ground, this, philosophical wrestling ground with clear eyes. We know who will die and how they die. We know that the courage these men cannot define will be displayed by one of them in a prison cell and by another on a losing battlefield. We know that the boys watching, Aristides and Thucydides, will grow up in a city that killed its wisest citizen. And we know that we, 2,500 years later, are still asking the same question and still unable to answer it without remainder. That shared incapacity is not an obstacle to understanding the Laches. It is, on the reading I am about to offer, the very gift the dialogue brings. The courage it teaches, and it does teach, is the courage to stand in perplexity when fleeing into easy answers. And the first step in receiving that gift is to acknowledge that we carry this into the palæstra, the whole tragic freight of the Socratic story, and the long, hopeful history of readers who refuse to let the aporia be the last word. 2. The theater of irony, a stage set with ghosts. All right, so the scene opens up at a wrestling ground, the palæstra. That site in Athenian culture where young men train their bodies, where older men gathered to watch, and converse, where the city's future was quite literally shaped through physical education. Lysimachus and Melesias, 2 elderly Athenians of distinguished lineage, have come to witness an exhibition of fighting in armor, hoplomachia. So performed by a certain Stacilius. This is another guy who was actually killed by the Spartan army, into the future. So they have invited 2 of Athens' most celebrated generals, Nicias or Nicias or Nicias and Laches, basically to advise them on whether this training should be part of their son's education. The generals disagree completely. And so as James Arete, or Arete, I'm not really sure how to pronounce his name, how he puts it is the comedy begins. Though it is a comedy shadowed by tragedy, let us pause to feel the weight of what Plato's audience knew. Nicias, the wealthy, pious, cautious politician who speaks first in favor of the training, would later command the Sicilian expedition, that catastrophic venture that destroyed Athenian power. Thucydides, the historian, portrays him as a man of genuine religious scruple whose very caution contributed to disaster. He refused to retreat from Syracuse because of a lunar eclipse and died a prisoner in the stone quarries, executed by the Syracusans. Laches, the blunt, experienced soldier who argues against the training with equal vigor, died at the Battle of Mantinea in 418, fighting bravely in the losing cause. That's 418 BC, by the way, if we're keeping up with, Plato. Socrates, the stonemason's son, called upon to arbitrate, would be executed. As we all know, he'll be executed by the city these generals served on charges of corrupting the youth he was here asked to educate. The fathers, too, carry their tragedies. Lysimachus is the son of Aristides the Just, the Athenian statesman renowned throughout Greece for his integrity. A man so honest that when an illiterate citizen asked him to write his own name on an ostracism shirt, these are like pieces of pottery that were used for like voting. Anyways, Aristides complied without complaint and accepted exile. Melesius is the son of Thucydides, the politician, not the historian, but the conservative rival of Pericles, who led aristocratic opposition to Athenian democracy and was himself ostracized in 443. Both grandfathers were great. Both fathers failed. Both sons fear the same fate of their own children. As Arete, the historian or Plato enthusiast, notes with devastating precision, the grandfathers themselves failed as fathers. They produced sons who never amounted to anything. The chain of failed inheritance stretches across 3 generations, and the dialogue asks whether it can be broken. The dramatic irony is almost unbearable. Lysimachus and Melesius ask Nicias and Laches and Socrates how to make their sons successes in life. And Plato's audience knows that all 3 advisors died in failure. Nicias in the stone quarries of Syracuse, Laches on the battlefield of Mantinea, Socrates by the city's poison. As Arete writes, it will not be possible for Plato's readers to forget this grim record of failure as they read the comedy Laches. The dialogue is thus not merely a philosophical inquiry, but a memorial, a way of preserving these men in the very act of exposing their ignorance and honoring Socrates through the demonstration that his method was not corruption, but liberation. The opening disagreement between the generals set the stage for everything that follows. Nicias argues that fighting in armor is excellent training, strenuous exercise for a free man, preparation for, the practical demands of war, an introduction to generalship. Laches responds with a defense of experience over novelty. The Spartans, the most warlike of Greeks, do not practice this art. Its teachers avoid Sparta, preferring to perform for softer audiences. And then he tells the story that gives the dialogue its first burst of genuine comedy. The story of Stilius at sea, wielding his bizarre scythe spear, getting it lodged in the side of an enemy transport, being dragged along the deck while enemies and friends alike laughed at the spectacle he cut. The story is farcical, but its philosophical point is sharp. Technical skill without practical wisdom becomes ridiculously precisely when it matters most. So Socrates enters not as an authority, but as a questioner. When Lysimachus asks him to cast the deciding vote, Socrates refuses. He shifts the ground entirely. They are not deliberating about a fight, fighting in armor. Socrates suggests that they are deliberating about the souls of young men. Fighting in armor is merely a means. The end is the cultivation of virtue. And if they are to judge whether a particular means serves that end, they must know what the end itself is. They must know what virtue is and who is skilled in producing it. This is not a question that can be settled by a majority vote. It requires knowledge. And before they can determine who has knowledge, they must determine what knowledge is required. The wrestling ground has been transformed. What began as a practical question about military training has become an inquiry into the nature of the soul. The physical setting becomes a metaphor for the true arena of education, not the training of bodies, but the formation of character. And the men who thought they were qualified to advise discover that they cannot even define the virtue that they are supposed to cultivate. 3. The dialectical architecture, 3 movements toward aporia. The Laches unfolds with the precision of a musical composition. And if we are to grasp its philosophical significance, we must follow its movements with the same attention we would bring to a symphony. The dialogue has 3 major movements: the disagreement of the experts, Socrates' redirection of the inquiry, and the successive refutation of the definitions of courage. Each movement builds upon the last, and the cumulative effect is not merely negative, not merely the exposure of ignorance, but the transformation of that exposure into a motive for shared search. First movement, the general's disagreement. You will find this between 178a and 184c. The initial exchange between Nicias and Laches is not philosophical argument, but expert opinion. Nicias, the sophisticated general who has studied with Damon, the musician, and is comfortable with abstract reasoning, sees value in the new art. Laches, the traditional soldier who trusts that he is, what he has seen in battle, he dismisses it. Their disagreement is complete and unresolved at the level of opinion because neither can give an account of the criterion by which the opinion should be judged. Lysimachus, caught between 2 authorities of equal reputation, does what anxious people do. He seeks a third opinion to break the tie. This is the moment Socrates has been waiting for. Though he has done nothing to engineer it, the failure of expertise to resolve a practical question opens the space for philosophy to enter. Second movement, the redirection. That's 184c from 190c. Socrates' intervention is the pivotal moment of the dialogue. He refuses to vote, and in refusing, he performs the fundamental Socratic gesture, the withdrawal from the plane of opinion to the plane of knowledge. He asks Nicias and Laches a series of devastatingly simple questions. Have they had teachers of virtue? Have they taught others? Can they point to students who have become virtuous under their guidance? And, the generals are timid. Their authority rests on reputation, not demonstration. On the fact that they have commanded armies and faced death, not on any proven capacity to transmit excellence. Socrates makes explicit what has been implicit. To advise on education without knowing what virtue is would be to risk the greatest harm, corrupting the sons of friends and getting the greatest blame from the nearest relatives. This is not an abstract caution. Plato's audience knows that Socrates himself will be executed on precisely this charge, corrupting the youth. The irony is deliberate and painful. Socrates proposes that they proceed by examining courage first, as a part of virtue, before attempting to grasp virtue as a whole. This strategy, examining the part to illuminate the whole, governs the rest of the dialogue. Yet, as we shall see, the dialogue's deepest insight is that courage cannot be understood as merely a part. The attempt is to isolate. I think that, to isolate it will prove its connection to everything else. The third movement, the definitions and their refutation. So this is found through 190c through 199e. Laches offers the first definition with the confidence of a man who has lived what he's trying to define. Quote, courage is staying at one's post and not running away, close quote. Socrates refutes him not with abstract argument, but with examples drawn from the very tradition that Laches honors. The Scythian cavalry fight, by retreating and counteracting, are they not courageous? The Spartans at Plataea retreated in good order before their decisive counterattack. Was that not courage? Homer's own Aeneas knew when to give ground. Laches' definition captures only the hoplite standing firm. It misses the courage of strategy, of adaptation, of knowing when persistence becomes folly. Laches tries again more broadly. Courage is, quote, endurance of the soul, end quote. This is an improvement. It moves from a specific action to a psychic quality. But Socrates introduces a distinction that will prove decisive. Endurance is noble only when accompanied by wisdom. Foolish endurance is not courage, but rashness. Yet here Laches encounters a paradox that goes to the heart of ordinary standing. So the soldier who stands his ground without skill or judgment, the fool who endures, is often called more courageous than the wise soldier who calculates correctly. Our language honors the fool in this case, not the sage. This creates a contradiction. Yes, courage is noble, but the definition makes it sometimes shameful. Laches is trapped by the very language he speaks. Nicias now enters with the definition he has heard from Socrates himself. Courage is, quote, the knowledge of what inspires fear or confidence in war or in anything, close quote. This is much more sophisticated. It makes wisdom essential to courage rather than accidental. It applies to all contexts, not merely the battlefield, and it seems to capture something deep, that the courageous person is distinguished not by what they do, but by what they know. Socrates examines it with the same rigor. He distinguishes Nicias' knowledge from the specialized knowledges of physicians and soothsayers. The physician knows whether a wound is fatal, but not whether death is truly to be feared. Perhaps it is better to die than to live in dishonor. The soothsayer knows what the future holds, but not which outcome is truly good. Courage, if it is knowledge of what to fear and what to dare, it must encompass knowledge of good and evil themselves. But if courage is knowledge of future goods and evils, it must also include knowledge of present and past goods and evils, for the same faculty that knows the future knows all times. There is one science of medicine that superintends health, in past, present, and future. One science of generalship that does the same for war. So courage, if it is knowledge of goods and evils across all time, is not a part of virtue, but virtue entire. It would include justice, temperance, holiness, and wisdom itself. The part has swallowed the whole. Nicias has defined courage so broadly that it has become indistinguishable from the totality of virtue. And here the dialogue achieves its characteristic ephoric, climax. Not a triumphant refutation, but a shared recognition that the inquiry must continue. Both generals have failed. Socrates himself confesses ignorance, and yet something remarkable happens. Instead of despairing, the entire group resolves to continue the search together. Socrates quotes a line from Homer, quote, "Modesty is not a good companion for a man in need," end quote. The shame that opened the dialogue, the shame of the Semiticus and Laches, has been transformed. It no longer paralyzes, it mobilizes. The old men, exposed in their ignorance, vow to become students again, to seek teachers, to pursue together the knowledge they lack. 4. The concept in its becoming. What the aporia births. If we mistake the Laches for a failed attempt to define courage, we have missed everything. The dialogue does not fail, it performs. It enacts the very process it recommends. And what it brings to birth is not a definition, but a transformation. Let us trace the concepts that come into being through the dialogue's movements, for they are the true offspring of this encounter. The first birth is the transfiguration of ados. That's a shame, from a paralyzing wound into a liberating force. The dialogue opens with Lysimachus and Meleases confessing their deepest humiliation. They have no achievements. Their fathers were giants. They themselves are invisible. This is the shame that silences, that keeps men from seeking help, because to seek help is to advertise need. But by the dialogue's end, the same shame has become the engine of philosophical eros, the recognition that one lacks what one most needs. That's, one's inherited status, wealth, and reputation. They don't constitute knowledge, and this, becomes the motive for inquiry. Socrates' quotation of Homer is not merely a literary flourish. It's a diagnosis. Modesty, the reluctance to appear needy, is the enemy of wisdom precisely when we are most in need. The Laches is not at its core a dialogue about overcoming this debilitating shame, about learning to be students even though we thought we were teachers. The young Aristides and Thucydides, named for their illustrious grandfathers, sit silently through the entire conversation. But they witness something more valuable than any definition. They see their elders confess ignorance and resolve to seek wisdom together. This is the only education the dialogue offers, and it may be sufficient. The second birth is the exposure of emperia. And this is a Greek word that I probably hacked up again as usual, but it means experience, as insufficient without logos. Laches and Nicias, or Nicias or Nicias, have experience in abundance, okay? They have commanded armies, faced enemies, endured hardships, but experience alone does not yield knowledge. It does not enable them to give an account of what they do, to define the virtue they embody, to teach it to others. They're like practitioners of an art who can perform but cannot explain, like Stelias with his scythe spear, adept at skill but unable to justify its value. This is the dialogue's central epistemological claim, and it carries devastating implications for any theory of education that relies on modeling, apprenticeship, or the mere transmission of practice. Gregory Vlastos, in his foundational studies of Socratic method, argued that the recognition of this gap between experience and knowledge is itself a form of progress, the necessary precondition for genuine inquiry. The third birth is the disclosure that courage, whatever it finally is, cannot be severed from phronesis. That's the wisdom or practical intelligence. Laches' endurance without wisdom proves to be rashness. Nicias' knowledge without endurance dissolves into a generic virtue indistinguishable from the whole. The dialogue suggests, without fully articulating, that courage is neither raw temperament nor abstract knowledge, but some integration of both, a wisdom that manifests specifically in the face of danger. The face of danger, fear, and conflicting passion. As Daniel Devereux has argued in his meticulous study of the unity of virtues, what distinguishes courage from the other virtues in the Laches is not a different kind of knowledge, for the knowledge involved is always knowledge of good and evil, but the quality of endurance, the way in which this knowledge manifests itself in the face of conflicting appetites and emotions. Courage is wisdom in endurance, not wisdom instead of endurance. So let's kind of take that with us as we go into the fourth and most radical birth, which is the dawning recognition that virtue may be one. When Nicias' definition expands to encompass all knowledge of goods and evils, Socrates does not reject it as false. He shows that it cannot be a definition of courage as a part of virtue because it describes the whole. This is not merely a logical refutation. It points toward the doctrine that would occupy Plato throughout his early and middle period: the unity of virtue, understood not as the identity of all virtues, they have different names and different manifestations, but as their inseparability through wisdom. As Devereux has shown, the Laches presents a distinctive version of this doctrine, while courage, temperance, justice, and piety are treated as distinct parts of virtue. Wisdom itself is described as the whole of virtue. The other virtues are parts of this whole. They are united through their common dependence on wisdom, and what differentiates them is not different knowledge, but different qualities or aspects. Endurance in the case of courage, restraint in the case of temperance. This is a subtler and more philosophically sophisticated view than what appears in the Protagoras, and it suggests that Plato was refining his teacher's legacy rather than simply recording it. Georgia Sermamolagu Solmamadi, and I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, in her important 2023 Aperion article, Georgia pushes this reading further. She argues against two common interpretive views. First, the Laches and Nicias' account should be read as complementary. Laches providing the endurance and Nicias the wisdom. And second, that Laches rejects the unity of virtue defended in the Protagoras. On her reading, quote, the reader of the Laches is invited to endorse Nicias. Nicias' unitary understanding of courage as knowledge of good and evil, as a consequence of this to grant the unity of virtue, end quote. The aporia is not a rejection of Nicias' definition, but a recognition that it states a truth about courage that cannot be captured within the framework of part and whole that the interlocutors have assumed. The dialogue ends in perplexity, not because Nicias was wrong, but because the question itself, what is courage as a part of virtue, it presupposes a distinction that the argument has shown to be untenable. I mean, this is profound. The Laches does not merely fail to define courage, it enacts the discovery that courage cannot be defined in isolation, that any adequate account of courage will be an account of virtue as such, and that the attempt to separate the virtues is itself a symptom of the ignorance that Socratic inquiry exists to dispel. The aporia is the birth pang of this insight, and the shared resolve to continue searching is its first cry. 5. The engine and its systematic place. So we have traced the dialect's three movements: the disagreement of experts, the redirection toward first principles, and the successive refutations that expose the inadequacy of every profound definition. Now we must ask what drives this engine and where it fits in the larger architecture of Plato's thoughts. For the Laches is not an isolated inquiry, it is a moment in a lifelong philosophical project, and its significance deepens when we see what precedes it and what it prepares. This thesis, excuse me, the thesis with which the dialogue begins is the conventional understanding of courage held by men of war, the hoplite ethic that stretches back through Homer to the darkest origins of Greek culture. Courage is standing firm. Courage is not running away. Courage is the virtue of the man who faces death in the battle and does not flinch. Laches embodies this understanding with complete sincerity. It has made him what he is. Nicias, more sophisticated, offers a Socratic sounding reformulation: courage as knowledge, but one that will still, it still preserves the conventional framework by making it knowledge of what is to be feared and dared, as if courage were a specialized expertise like medicine or generalship. The antithesis is the elenchus itself. So Socrates' relentless questioning that exposes the gap between convention and knowledge, between performance and understanding, between the part and the whole. The counterexamples that refute Laches' first definition are not arbitrary. They are drawn from the military tradition that Laches himself reveres. The Scythians, the Spartans at Plataea, Homer's Aeneas, these are not exotic cases, but central instances of Greek martial culture. And they show that the tradition itself contains resources for transcending its own limitations. When Socrates pushes Nicias' knowledge until it swallows all virtue, he is not playing a logical trick. He is demonstrating that the knowledge required for courage is not a specialized technique, but the comprehensive knowledge of good and evil that would constitute the whole of wisdom. The synthesis does not arrive as a tidy resolution. It arrives as, aporia. The recognition that the inquiry must continue, that the conventional understanding has been shown inadequate, that a new beginning is necessary. This is the characteristic of the early dialogues and has led some readers to see them as purely negative, as exhibitions of Socratic skepticism without positive doctrinal content. But this reading misses the Laches performance. What the Laches performs. The aporia is not empty. It is full of direction. It tells us what courage is not mere standing firm, not endurance without wisdom, not specialized knowledge of future dangers. And in telling us what courage is not, it constrains what courage can be. The space of possible answers has narrowed, and the remaining candidates all point toward the unity of virtue through wisdom. Retrospectively, the Laches resolves tensions without open in earlier definitional inquiries. The ones that were left open, okay? The Euthyphro asks what piety is, and it ends unable to distinguish it from justice. The Charmides asks what temperance is and ends unable to specify the subject of the knowledge that would constitute it. The Laches takes the next step. It shows that the difficulty is not accidental but systematic. Any attempt to define a single virtue in isolation will generate the same aporia because the virtues are not isolable. What is F? All right, question. pursued with Socratic rigor, forces the recognition that the part cannot be known without the whole. Prospectively, the aporia generated here demands resolution. The Meno will take up the challenge by introducing the theory of recollection and the method of hypothesis, the epistemological framework that makes progress possible despite initial ignorance. The Protagoras will explore the unity of virtue more directly, though, as Devereux has argued, with a different and perhaps less coherent account than Laches provided. And the Republic will offer the full constructive theory, a tripart psychology that locates courage in the thymoids. That's like the spirited part of the soul, distinct from the rational part that knows the good, yet integrated with it through the rule of wisdom. The Laches thus stands at a crossroads. It is the last of the purely operatic dialogues on virtue, the one that pushes the negative method to its limit and thereby creates the necessity for the positive doctrine to come. Well, the doctrines, for the positive doctrines to come. Within the corpus, the Laches is also unique in its dramatic register. It is the only early dialogue that James Arete reads as a genuine comedy, not merely as containing comic elements, but as structured farce. So that's kind of interesting. The generals bicker like children, delighting when the other blunders. The fathers are self-confessed failures, seeking advice from doomed men. Stesilas with the scythe spear, provides pure slapstick. And Lysimachus, Arete suggests, is an ancient Rodney Dangerfield, going back to school with his youngsters. Yet this comedy is shadowed by the tragedy the audience cannot forget. The laughter catches in the throat because we know how these stories end. This tonal complexity, comedy performed over some sort of abyss, it makes the Laches dramatically richer than its companion dialogues and explains why its aporia feels not like failure, but like the only honest response to the human condition. And I you just have to really wonder about Plato's psychological condition, the psychological conditioning of when he wrote Republic or when he wrote these dialogues. And I mean, this is like 10 years after Socrates was executed. Laches was, and all of these soldiers, these generals, like they're all dead. All of these guys are dead by the time Plato was writing this book, or this dialogue. So it's really something to think about. All right. That was part 5, the engine and its systematic place. And now we're on to part 6. All right, 6, the ghost beneath the text. Every philosophical text is a palimpsest, right? It's a palimpsest, a page written over other pages, bearing traces of voices that preceded it. The Laches is no exception, and to read it well, we must learn to hear the ghosts that speak through its characters. Some of these ghosts are named. Others lurk in the margins, but all of them contribute to the dialogue's extraordinary density. Homer is the deepest presence. Though he is explicitly quoted only once, at the end when Socrates cites the line about modesty not being a good companion for a man in need. But Homer has been present from the first word. I mean, the hoplite ethic, the hoplite is, these Athenian soldiers, the hoplite ethic that Laches embodies descends directly from the Homeric hero, Achilles, Achilles, refusal to yield. to yield. And Ajax's steadfastness, Hector's commitment to glory won in battle. When Laches offers his first definition, quote, staying at one's post and not running away, end quote, he is quoting the Iliad without knowing it, or does he know it? And when Socrates refutes him by citing Aeneas, the very Aeneas who knew when strategic retreat was necessary, he is using Homer against the Homeric tradition, showing that the poet himself recognized more complex courage than simple steadfastness. I mean, Plato's strategy is not to reject Homer, but to reread him, to find within the tradition the resources for transcending it. Sparta haunts the dialogue as the unspoken alternative to Athenian education. Laches invokes Spartan practice explicitly. If fighting in armor were truly valuable, the Spartans would have adopted it. But Sparta represents more than a military example. It's agoge, the systematic training of youth through discipline, hardship, and collective discipline, claimed to produce courage, as a reproducible outcome. Athens had nothing comparable. Athenian education was private, haphazard, dependent on fathers who might or might not know how to form their sons. The Laches is, among other things, a meditation on this Athenian failure. The dialogue's opening. Two fathers unable to educate their sons, seeking experts who also fail, enacts the crisis of a city who has left its most important task to chance. The sophists are present, though largely unnamed, like Damon, the musician philosopher whom Nicias has studied with, was associated with the intellectual circles around Pericles, Prodicus, and the sophist, famous for making fine distinctions, is mentioned as Damon's colleague. And Nicias attempted to distinguish courage from fearlessness is traced to this sophistic source. The sophists claimed to teach virtue, to prepare young men for success in public life. Nicias' definition echoes sophistic teaching, and Socrates' examination of it exposes its hollowness. The sophists knew how to speak about virtue, but not how to define it. They could train politicians, but not philosophers. Plato absorbs their claim and that virtue can be taught and transforms it by specifying what true teaching must be. Not rhetorical persuasion, but dialectical examination, not the transmission of opinion, but the shared pursuit of knowledge. Thucydides, the historian, is perhaps the most poignant ghost. Plato's dialogue is saturated with allusions to his work. The mention of the Battle of Delium, where Laches praises Socrates' conduct, this recalls Thucydides' detailed account of that defeat. The mention of Lamachus, Nicias' colleague on the Sicilian expedition, this gently reminds the audience of the catastrophe to come. The very characters of Nicias and Laches are drawn in part from Thucydides' portrait of Athenian leadership during the Peloponnesian War. Nicias, the pious, cautious man whose very caution becomes fatal, and Laches, the honest soldier caught in political currents he cannot control. Plato takes the historian's consciousness of failure and turns it inward. The catastrophe is not merely military but educational. The defeat is not merely of Athens, but of the whole project of transmitting excellence from one generation to the next. Socrates himself is the most complex ghost. Plato is writing about his teacher, a man who left no writings, whose thought is only known through the dialogues of his students. The Laches is therefore a double transformation. It presents a Socrates who is both historical and constructed. Both the man Plato knew and the philosopher Plato needed him to be. The historical Socrates probably did question generals about courage. The Platonic Socrates does so with a dramatic artistry that transforms the event into a paradigm. Harold Bloom's concept of the anxiety of influence, the strong poet's struggle to overcome his precursors while preserving them. This finds no more perfect illustration than Plato's relationship to Socrates. He cannot simply repeat his teacher. He must transcend him. Yet he cannot transcend him without honoring him. The Laches is one moment in that lifelong wrestling match. The moment when Plato shows that Socratic ignorance is not a limitation, but a method, not a failure, but the necessary condition for genuine search. 7. The courage to not know, a deliberate misprision. All right, let me now venture reading that some will call perverse. A creative misprision, in Harold Bloom's sense, a deliberate swerve from the text that reveals what the text cannot say directly. The Laches ends in aporia, right? No definition of courage is found. The generals are refuted, Socrates confesses ignorance, and yet and yet something has been accomplished. What? What has been accomplished? The misprision I offer is this. The Laches does not fail to define courage. It succeeds in showing that courage is the willingness to endure the absence of definition. The dialogue's core achievement is the transmutation of shame into inquiry, of inherited failure into shared search. The courage that cannot be spoken is the courage that keeps speaking. Consider the figure of Moses on Mount Nebo. He leads his people through 40 years of wandering, stands at last on the mountain's height, sees the promised land spread before him in all of its fullness, and is told he will not enter. Moses dies there on the threshold with the goal in sight, but unattained. The Laches may very well be Plato's Nebo. We see the promised land of virtue, the knowledge of goods and evils that would unite all the virtues into one. But for some reason, we do not enter. Socrates dies on this mountain too, in every operatic dialogue. And Plato's art consists in making us feel that death as the necessary precondition for the journey. This reading finds unexpected support in the tradition of negative theology. When Nicias defines courage as the knowledge of what it is to be feared and what it is to be dared, and Socrates pushes that definition until it swallows all virtue, we are witnessing something like a philosophical via negativia. Courage is not this, not that. It is not Laches' endurance, not Nicias' knowledge of particulars. It is approachable only through the relentless negation of every inadequate account. The apophatic mystics like Pseudo Dionysius or Meister Eckhart would recognize this method. To speak of the highest things, one must unspeak every name. Plato unspeaks every definition of courage, and in the unspeaking, He opens a space where something new might eventually be spoken. But let me press this further with a parable that circles back to our beginning here. A father teaches his son to swim by throwing him in the deep water. Okay, the son thrashes, swallows water, fears drowning. But in that thrashing, he learns what no calm instruction could teach. The knowledge that his body will float, that panic is the enemy, that the water will hold him only when he lets it. The Laches throws us into deep water. We thrash through refutations, swallow the aporia, fear we will never reach the shore of definition. But in that thrashing, we learn something the calm possession of a definition could never teach. That the search itself is the swimming, that the courage to inquire is the courage we sought all along. What has the process accomplished? It has transformed us from passive recipients of inherited wisdom into active seekers of wisdom we do not yet possess. Lysimachus and Melesius came to receive advice. They leave committed to the search. Laches and Nicias came to give counsel. They leave exposed in their ignorance, but liberated by that exposure. The young men came to watch an exhibition of fighting. They leave having witnessed something far more important, the exhibition of philosophy itself. The circle closes not on a definition, but on a decision. The decision to continue the search together. That, I submit, is the only definition of courage the dialogue will give us. And perhaps it is enough. Perhaps it is, in the end, courage to admit that we do not know what courage is, and the courage to keep seeking anyway. And maybe the courage to keep seeking anyway is the only courage that can be taught, because it's the only courage that is also a form of love. 8. 3 modern mirrors. We who teach, who parent, who try to lead others toward wisdom, we ourselves do not fully possess. We face the same challenge Socrates faced. How do we guide those in our care from received opinion to genuine inquiry, from shame to search, from the inheritance of dead formulas to the living pursuit of truth? Let me offer 3 analogies that illuminate the Laches for our world, each drawn from contemporary life, but faithful to the dialogue spirit. The Olympic champion and the sports scientist. So, imagine 2 figures in contemporary athletics. The first is a veteran Olympic champion, a swimmer who has won multiple gold medals, who knows every nuance of the water, every strategy of the race. Their experience is vast, their achievements undeniable. The second, a sports scientist who has never competed at an elite level, who perhaps cannot even swim at all, but who understands the physics of fluid dynamics, the physiology of muscle fatigue, the psychology of peak performance. And now ask, who truly knows swimming? The champion can do it. The scientist can explain it. Each form of knowledge has its power. Each has its limits. Laches is the Olympic champion of courage. He has stood in the phalanx, faced the Spartan charge, held his ground when men around him fell. But when Socrates asks him to define courage, to give an account of what he knows, he flounders like a swimmer asked to explain fluid dynamics. Nicias is the sports scientist. He has heard Socratic definitions. He can recite sophisticated formulas about knowledge of goods and evils. But when his definition is tested, it proves too broad, swallowing all virtue. The Laches teaches us that both forms of knowledge are incomplete. Embodied skill without articulate understanding cannot be taught. Theoretical understanding without lived experience cannot be trusted. The education of the soul requires both the medical diagnosis and the patient's experience. So, consider a patient suffering from chronic pain. She has lived with this condition for years. She knows its rhythms, its triggers, its subtle variations. Her knowledge is intimate, detailed, experiential. The physician, by contrast, may have only met her twice, run some tests, consulted a textbook. Yet when it comes to the treatment, to the question of what must be done, the physician's knowledge trumps the patient's experience. The patient knows, she knows that she hurts. The physician knows why and what can be done. This is precisely the distinction Socrates draws between the practitioner of fighting and armor and the true educator. The practitioner knows his art. He can demonstrate it, teach it, perform it. But does he know whether it produces virtue? That requires a different kind of knowledge, knowledge of the soul, of the good, of the end toward which all education aims. The generals have experience of war. They have faced death and commanded armies. But experience of war is not knowledge of courage, any more than experience of pain is knowledge of medicine. The startup founder and the business school professor. Picture a startup founder who has built a successful company through instinct, determination, and sheer force of will. They have never studied business formally. They've learned by doing, by failing, by pivoting when necessary. Their success is real. Now picture a business school professor who has never started a company, but has studied hundreds of cases. He knows the theories of organizational behavior. He can recite the principle of strategic management. Who knows more about business? The founder has phronesis, practical wisdom, the ability to act rightly in concrete situations. The professor has episteme. Yes, the theoretical knowledge, the ability to articulate principles. The Laches asks whether either can educate the young. The founder can tell stories, but may not be able to explain why their decisions worked. The professor can explain theories, but may not know how they apply in the chaos of real markets. Socrates' intervention suggests a third possibility. The educator must be both practitioner and theorist, must have fought and reflected, must unite experience with logos. This is a high standard, so high that the dialogue cannot point to anyone who meets it fully, but it sets a standard nonetheless. 9. The afterlife of a question. The Laches has haunted Western thought for 2.5 millennia. I'm sure I'm going to say this about like every one of the dialogues. Not as a solved problem, but as an open wound. Okay, its legacy. Okay, sorry. Its legacy is the legacy of a question that refuses closure. What is courage, and how could it be taught? In the Platonic corpus itself, the Laches initiates a conversation that will occupy its author for decades. The protagonist takes up the same question, asking whether courage could be separated from the other virtues, though, as Devereux has argued, with a different and perhaps less coherent account of their unity. The Meno introduces the theory of recollection to explain how virtue can be sought without being known. And the Republic finally offers the full constructive theory, the tripart soul with its 3 virtues. Wisdom is the rational part, courage in the spirited part, and temperance in the harmonious relation between them. The Laches thus prepares the ground for Plato's mature psychology, even as it performs the negative work that makes such positive construction necessary. You know, Aristotle must have known the Laches intimately. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he takes up its questions and transforms them. Courage for Aristotle is the mean between fear and confidence, concerned primarily with death in battle, but distinguishable from the courage of citizens, which is like a soldier's courage but less steady. And from the courage of experience, which is really confidence based on past success, Aristotle's definition can be read as an attempt to salvage what Plato's aporia left unresolved, to find a stable account of courage that preserves its distinctness from the other virtues. Yet even Aristotle preserves the laches, its core insight. True courage requires knowledge, for the brave man, quote, fears the right things for the right motive in the right way at the right time, end quote, which is precisely, quote, as a wise man would, end quote. The Stoics took up the dialogue's suggestion and elevated it into dogma. For Zeno and Chrysippus, all virtues are modes of wisdom. The courageous person is precisely the one who knows what is truly to be feared, evil, and what is not, death, pain, reputation. This is essentially Nicias' definition, right? Purified of its Socratic refutation and made the cornerstone of an entire ethical system. Now, where the Laches left the matter in suspense, the Stoics pronounced with certainty, and in their certainty, they lost something essential to the dialogue's spirit. In the medieval period, Thomas Aquinas distinguished between natural courage, that's the soldier's endurance akin to Laches' virtue, and infused courage, the gift of the Holy Spirit, which transcends natural temperament. This distinction echoes Plato's separation of conventional courage from true courage that requires wisdom. Though Aquinas frames it in theological terms that would have been foreign to the Athenian wrestling ground, modern scholarship has made the Laches central to debates about the Socratic problem and the development of Plato's thought. Gregory Vlastos treated it as a prime exhibit for his distinction between the early Socratic dialogues and the later Platonic ones. Here, Terry Penner and Daniel Davro have debated its implications for the unity of virtue thesis. Penner defending the strong identity interpretation according to which the virtues are all the same knowledge. Devereux arguing for the more nuanced view that the Laches presents, in which wisdom is the whole and the other virtues are its parts, distinguished by qualities like endurance rather than by different knowledges. Walter T. Schmidt's On Manly Courage offers the most sustained reading of the dialogue as an exploration of tension between traditional and philosophical conceptions. And Sirmamoglu Solmadi's 2023 article presents the most important recent contribution, arguing that Laches invites its readers to endorse Nicias' definition and thus the unity of virtue despite the surface appearance of refutation. The dialogue has also shaped literature and culture in ways its author could have not anticipated. Shakespeare's Henry V, rallying his troops with the claim that those who shed blood with him shall be his brothers, dramatizes the gap between the conventional martial courage and the knowledge that would justify it. Tolstoy's War and Peace dissects the courage of soldiers and generals with a Socratic eye, exposing the chasm between the battlefield experience and genuine understanding. Hemingway's definition of courage as grace under pressure is an implicit response to the Laches, an attempt to capture in a phrase what Plato could not capture in a definition. In our time, the Laches speaks to debate about virtue, ethics, moral education, and the psychology of courage. Military academics still struggle to define and teach what they most value. Business schools debate whether leadership can be cultivated. Positive psychology has rediscovered courage as a character strength. The dialogue's central insight that experience without wisdom cannot educate, and wisdom without experience is empty. This remains as urgent as the day it was written. 10. What the dialogue cannot resolve. No honest reading of the Laches can ignore the tensions it raises without resolving. Questions that expose not merely the limits of the interlocutors, but the limits of the philosophical project itself. Let us look these tensions in the face. The dialogue presupposes a world of leisure and privilege. Its characters are wealthy men who have time to spend at wrestling grounds, who can afford teachers for their sons, who move in circles where philosophical conversation is possible. Lysimachus and Milesius are ashamed of their mediocrity, but their shame is the shame of the elite. They have failed to live up to the standard of their class, not the standard of humanity. Does the dialogue have anything to say to those who are not wealthy, not leisured, not part of the aristocratic culture of 5th century Athens? It's Socrates himself, the stonemason's son. He represents a kind of answer. Wisdom is not inherited with wealth, but the dialogue as a whole does not seriously address those excluded from its circle. The women, the slaves, the laborers who made Athenian culture possible are silent presences. And their silence is a question that Laches he cannot answer. The paradox of teaching virtue haunts every page. The generals cannot teach it, though they embody it. The teachers of fighting in armor cannot teach it, though they claim to. Socrates cannot teach it, though he seeks it. And yet the dialogue ends with everyone resolved to continue the search together, as if the search itself were like a form of teaching. This is the paradox that has plagued every educational reformer since Plato. If virtue cannot be taught, why do we educate? If it can be taught, why do the virtuous so often fail to produce virtuous children? The Laches exposes this paradox with honesty, but cannot resolve it. Its aporia is genuine, and the frustration it produces is part of its pedagogy. The silence of the young is perhaps the most striking absence in the dialogue. Aristides and Thucydides, named for their illustrious grandfathers, the reason for the entire gathering, sit through the entire conversation without speaking a word. They are the occasion for the inquiry. The future, the older men are trying to secure. They have no voice. Is this Plato's comment on the nature of education, that the young must listen before they can speak? Or is it a failure of imagination and inability to conceive of the young as participants in their own formation? Modern pedagogy insists that the young must speak, must question, must actively engage if they are to learn. The Laches offers a model in which they are passive witnesses to adult perplexity. There is wisdom in both models, and the tension between them is not resolved. Finally, the gender of courage. The Laches is explicitly and exclusively masculine. Courage is the virtue of the soldier, the general, the citizen warrior. The examples are all male. The speakers are all male. The young men being educated are male. Women only appear as absences. Yet the dialogue's own arguments point toward a broader conception. If courage is knowledge of goods and evils, it cannot be restricted to just the battlefield. It must encompass every human choice, every moral decision, every confrontation with fear. This broader courage is available to everyone. Women as much as to men, of course, and to slaves as much as citizens. This goes without saying. Plato does not draw this conclusion, he implies it. His imagination is bounded by humanity, but his writing is bound to his culture and time, his politics. Yes, and of course, again, his time. 11. The door remains open. All right, so we come now to the edge of our inquiry. I know I've gone on way too long. The book will not take you this long to read. If you've already read it and you're listening to my commentary, please give me your own thoughts. But, we've come to the moment when we must realize that Laches is back into the silence from which it spoke. Okay. He must release. This is where we release. Okay. Laches is back into the silence from which it spoke. But before we do, as if we're just leaving the story. Okay. But before we do that, let me leave you with a thought that has haunted me through every reading of this dialogue. A thought that returns us to where we began, to the father standing before his father's portrait in the fading light. The dialogue opens with Lysimachus and Nicias confessing that they have no achievements to recount. They have lived in the shadow of their father's glory and have found themselves wanting. They hope their sons will be different. They hope education will accomplish what inheritance could not. But consider the fathers whose glory so oppresses them. Aristides, the just, Thucydides, the politician, were themselves, they were once young men. Once they were sons, once haunted by the achievements of their own progenitors. The chain stretches back beyond memory and forward beyond hope. Every generation inherits names it cannot fill, standards it cannot meet, expectations it cannot satisfy. Every generation feels the shame of falling short, and yet, out of that very shame, philosophy is born. The recognition that we are not what we should be becomes the motive for seeking what we might become. The failure of inheritance becomes the birth of inquiry. The silence of the fathers become the question of the sons. Plato wrote the Laches in the shadow of his own teacher's death, in the shadow of Athens' fall, in the shadow of a city that had killed the wisest man it knew. He wrote it as a son who had inherited a name he would make immortal, a teacher he would preserve forever, a philosophical project that would outlast the empire that had executed its founder. He wrote it, I believe, for everyone who has ever felt the weight of a name too heavy to bear, the shame of a standard too high to reach, the fear that we will pass on to our children only what we ourselves have failed to become. And what does he tell us? He tells us that the shame is real, but it is not the end. He tells us that the failure to define courage is not failure, but beginning. He tells us that the search itself is the only inheritance worth bequeathing, not because the search guarantees success, but because the search is the only form of courage that can be transmitted, the only virtue that teaching can actually accomplish. Quote, modesty is not a good companion for a man in need, end quote. The shame that silences us is the enemy of wisdom. The shame that drives us to seek is its friend. The Laches stands at the door of that distinction. A door it opens but does not walk through, a door that remains open for us, for our sons and daughters, for every generation that inherits what it cannot fulfill and must therefore begin again. The generals could not define courage, and neither can we. But we can do what they did in the end: admit our ignorance, resolve to seek together, and trust that the courage to inquire is itself a form of the courage we seek. That is Laches' gift, as urgent now as it was in the dust of the Athenian wrestling ground 24 centuries ago. The door has been left open. I suppose the rest is for us. And now I'm going to leave you with the chapter by chapter breakdown. And I actually, we'll see. We'll see. I might get inspired here, but we'll see. Okay, so this is based on the source markers, the Stephanus markings. All right, 170a to 179a. Lysimachus introduces the purpose of the gathering. He's seeking on their sons, introduces their sons, Aristides and Thucydides, after their grandfathers. Okay. And what do we got next here? 179a through 180a. Lysimachus explains their motivation. They are ashamed of their own lack of noble achievements compared to their fathers, and thus, seek pursuits like fighting in armor that will help their sons become excellent. Okay, so 180a through 181b. Laches and Nicias agree to cooperate. Laches introduces Socrates, praising him as knowing him his connection to Lysimachus's district. Nicias has confirmed Socrates' involvement, recommending Damon. Lysimachus recognizes Socrates as his father's friend. The boys confirm Socrates as the man they praise, and Laches praises Socrates' conduct at the fighting at Delium. 181c through 184c. Lysimachus asks Socrates to cast a vote. Socrates insists on hearing Nicias and Laches first. Nicias supports learning fighting in armor. He thinks it benefits include physical exercise, use in battle, leading to generalship and improved appearance. Laches opposes this, because the Spartans overlooked it. Practitioners fail in real battle, like Stesilaus, who the Sith, the Sith winding spear guy. He got killed by the Spartans, that guy. And so it reveals cowards and attracts criticism from the brave. Okay, for the brave. 184d through 185e. Socrates challenges the idea of deciding by majority, asserting that decisions must be based on knowledge. He shifts the focus. They are deliberating about the soul of the young men, not the specific training. 186a, 187b. Socrates demands evidence of knowledge and soul tending, either good teachers or deeds, proving that they have made others good. Socrates admits his own ignorance. He warns against running risks with their sons, quote unquote, practicing pottery on too large a vessel. 187c, 189c. Nicias and Laches agree to be questioned. Nicias explains that engaging with Socrates inevitably means being tested about one's life, which he welcomes, citing Solon's maxim, and Laches praises Socrates for possessing the Doric mode, harmony of words and deeds, and agrees to submit to scrutiny. 189D, 190E, Socrates takes the lead. He establishes that to advise on acquiring excellence, they must first know what excellence is. Since fighting in armor seems to promote courage, they agree to define courage, a part of excellence. 190E through 192B, Laches' first definition. Courage is remaining at one's post and not running away. Refutation. Socrates uses examples of courageous flight, the Scythians, the Spartans at Plataea, and expands courage to include resistance to desire, pleasure, poverty, and disease. 192B, 194C, Laches' second definition. Courage is endurance of the soul, redefined to wise endurance, since courage must be noble. Refutation here. Socrates shows that foolish endurance, the unskilled risk-taking, is deemed more courageous than the calculating wise endurance, So the foolish endurance, unskilled risk-taking, is deemed more courageous than calculating wise endurance. Laches is left in perplexity, noting that the lack of concord between their words and deeds, not in the Doric mode. Okay, consider what has just transpired before our eyes. We are witnessing not merely a debate between two soldiers, but an irreconcilable collision between two fundamental ways of being in the world. On one side stands Laches, who embodies that ancient commentators, recognized as the Doric harmony, and insistent that a man's speech must chime perfectly with his battlefield record. For Laches, virtue does not reside in abstract syllogisms. It is etched into the flesh, forged through physical endurance, and proven under fire. He views the soul through the rearview mirror of past deeds. Yet when Socrates invites him into the dialectical ring, this purely martial instinct collapses. Action without any articulate grounding turns mute under scrutiny. Enter Nicias, who represents the opposing extreme, the intellectualized, calculating, general who sits in the council of war and equates excellence entirely with foresight. Nicias insists that courage is not muscle but mind, a precise knowledge of future goods and evils. As the literary critic Harold Bloom observed when examining Shakespearean tragedy, there is a profound chasm between the soldier of pure instinct and the contemplative mind paralyzed by the horizon of what is to come. Laches is stranded in the brute fact of past action. Nicias is marooned in the cognitive anticipation of the future. Plato arranges this dramatic agony, the agon, I guess you would say, more like, so that we can see how both poles of Athenian leadership fail. When isolated from a unified grasp of the good, the man of sheer deed becomes blind, and the man of shared intellect becomes hollow. 194C through 197E, Nicias' definition. Courage is wisdom, specifically the knowledge of what is to be feared and what is to be ventured. Laches critiques this by citing physicians and farmers. Nicias distinguishes his definition. Courage is knowledge of what is ultimately better, life or death, which neither physicians nor soothsayers possess. Socrates uses the examples of wild animals, noting Nicias' definition excluded them from being courageous, calling them merely fearless or stupid. 198A through to 200A, Socrates' refutation of Nicias. They agree that fear relates to future evils. Socrates argues that knowledge covers past, present, and future aspects of a subject. Therefore, courage, as knowledge of goods, evils, must cover all goods and evil in all cases. This means Nicias' definition describes excellence in its entirety. Not just courage is a part of excellence, failing the original task. All right, so I got to do it. I got to end this on a part 12. 12. The Socratic turn. The courage to not know. All right, so let us step back and ask what this encounter ultimately demands of us. When the dialectical net tightens at the close of the dialogue, we do not encounter the triumph of an academic system. We meet a scene of extraordinary human vulnerability. Nicias and Laches, realizing their definitions have dissolved, they begin to trade petty insults, each trying to deflect the sting of exposure. Lysimachus, still trapped in the mindset of a patron seeking a master craftsman, turns to Socrates and asks him to take charge of the boys. Listen to how Socrates responds. He does not step onto the vacant pedestal. He actually refuses the mantle of the professional educator. Instead, he tells the assembled company that all of them, without exception, have ended in an identical state of perplexity. And then he offers an astonishing proposal. He suggests that they must all seek a teacher together, not just the adolescent sons, but the aging fathers and the decorated generals alike. As Socrates reminds them, quoting a line from Homer's Odyssey, modesty is no good companion for a man in need. Here, Plato executes one of the most radical reversals in the history of thought. The dialogue began with an anxiety over technical instruction, a frantic search by failing aristocrats for an external mechanism to manufacture nobility, but it ends by dismantling the entire apparatus of worldly authority. Philosophers across the ages have returned to this pivotal insight. Immanuel Kant argued in his famous essay on enlightenment that the true barrier to human maturity is not an absence of intellect, but a lack of courage to think for oneself without the guidance of another. Centuries before Kant formulated that civic challenge, Plato dramatized its birth. To live in the shadow of great forebearers, whether they are the historical architects of an empire or the cultural traditions that precede us, is to feel the temptation of outsourcing our virtue. We look for technical boot camps, institutional credentials, or celebrated experts to relieve us of the burden of self-examination. We hope that excellence can be inherited like a family trust or purchased like a course of lessons. The Laches destroys that comfort. And if anything, it teaches us that courage is neither the unreflective impulse to hold one's post, nor the detached calculation of prospective risks. True courage begins at the threshold of aporia, in the willingness to stand in the quiet shock of our own ignorance, to strip away the armaments of inherited prestige, and to begin the lifelong labor of caring for the soul and finding your way. Thank you.